The heavy oak doors of the Dallas County Family Courthouse groaned as they swung open, and 7-year-old Emma stepped into the marble hallway with hesitant, careful steps. Her small hand gripped the leather leash attached to Max, her golden retriever, whose amber eyes seemed to understand every flutter of her anxious heart. The dog stayed perfectly aligned with her left leg, his training evident in every measured movement he made. Emma's other hand clutched a worn stuffed rabbit that she'd had since she was 3, a comfort item her therapist said she could bring. The courthouse smelled like old paper, floor polish, and something else Emma couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe, or sadness. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an irritating hum that made her want to cover her ears, but she knew that would make her look babyish. Her mother, Jennifer, walked beside her, one protective hand resting on Emma's shoulder. Jennifer's eyes were already red and puffy from crying, and she kept glancing down at her daughter with a mixture of love and guilt that Emma had learned to recognize over the past year. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," Jennifer whispered, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. "Just remember what doctor told you. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. Max is here, I'm here." But Jennifer wasn't telling the whole truth, and Emma knew it. Nothing about today felt okay. Today was the day the judge would decide where she would live, who she would live with, and whether Max could stay with her. The thought of being separated from Max made Emma's chest feel tight, like someone was sitting on it. Her breathing quickened slightly, and immediately Max pressed closer against her leg, a subtle reminder that he was there, that he was watching, that she wasn't alone. They entered courtroom 4B, and Emma's stomach dropped. The room was bigger than she'd imagined, with high ceilings and wood paneling that made everything feel old and serious. Rows of benches sat empty except for a few people she didn't recognize, probably lawyers or court staff. At the front of the room was an elevated desk where the judge would sit, looking down at everyone like a queen on a throne. Emma had seen courtrooms on TV, but being in one was completely different. This was real. This would change her life. Her father, Michael, was already seated on the opposite side of the room with his attorney, a sharp-looking woman in a navy suit who carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Emma's entire wardrobe. Michael was dressed in his best suit, the charcoal gray one he wore to important business meetings. His hair was perfectly styled, and he sat with his shoulders back, projecting confidence. But when his eyes met Emma's, something flickered across his face. Was it sadness? Guilt? Love? Emma couldn't tell anymore. She used to know everything about her father, but in the past year, he'd become a stranger. Next to Michael sat Corinne, his new wife. She was younger than Jennifer, with hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Corinne had been nice enough to Emma during their few supervised visits, but there was something calculating about her, something that made Emma uncomfortable. And Emma knew, though no one had said it directly, that Corinne didn't like Max. She'd made comments about dog hair, about allergies she claimed to have, about how a child Emma's age should be more independent. Jennifer guided Emma to their side of the courtroom, and they sat on a wooden bench that felt hard and cold even through Emma's dress. Max settled at her feet, positioning himself so that part of his body touched her legs. It was a small thing, but it helped. Emma focused on the warmth of his fur, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid reality of his presence. The bailiff, a tall man with a gray mustache, stood near the judge's bench looking bored. A court reporter sat ready at her strange typing machine, fingers poised. Jennifer's attorney, Mr. David Santos, arrived moments later, setting down his briefcase and offering Emma a kind smile. He told her during their preparation meeting that she was brave, that she was strong, but Emma didn't feel brave or strong. She felt small and scared and desperately wished she could disappear. "All rise," the bailiff announced suddenly, his voice booming through the courtroom. Everyone stood as Judge entered through a side door. She was a woman in her mid-50s with dark hair streaked with gray, pulled back into a tight bun. Her black robe swished as she walked, and her face was set in an expression that Emma's mother would call no-nonsense. Judge had kind eyes, Emma noticed, but they were also tired eyes eyes that had seen too many families torn apart, too many children caught in the middle of adult problems. "Please be seated," Judge said, settling into her high-backed leather chair. She adjusted her reading glasses and began shuffling through a thick folder of papers. Emma recognized some of the documents, medical records, school reports, statements from her therapist. Her entire life reduced to papers in a manila folder. The judge's eyes scanned the courtroom, taking in both parents, their attorneys, and finally landing on Emma and Max. Judge's expression softened almost imperceptibly when she saw the little girl with the service dog. She'd probably seen many difficult cases, but something about Emma seemed to give her pause. "This is case number 2024 FC 8847 versus," the judge began, her voice formal but not unkind. "Petition for modification of temporary custody arrangements regarding the minor child, Emma. Are both parties present with counsel?" "Yes, Your Honor," both attorneys responded in unison. Judge nodded and continued reviewing her notes. The silence in the courtroom was oppressive, broken only by the soft scratching of the court reporter's fingers on her machine and the quiet panting of Max. Emma felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Her palms were sweaty, and the stuffed rabbit in her hand felt damp from her nervous grip. Across the room, Michael sat with his jaw clenched, staring straight ahead. Karen leaned over and whispered something in his ear, and he nodded slightly. Jennifer, beside Emma, was breathing in that careful, controlled way she did when she was trying not to cry. Emma knew that sound well. She'd heard it many nights through her bedroom wall. "Before we begin," Judge said, looking directly at Emma, "I want to acknowledge that you're here today, Emma, and that this must be very difficult for you. I want you to know that this court's primary concern is your safety. Do you understand?" Emma managed a small nod, unable to trust her voice. "I also see that you have a service animal with you. The court has reviewed the documentation regarding Max's certification. He is welcome to remain with you throughout these proceedings." Relief flooded through Emma, and she felt Max's tail thump softly against her leg, as if he understood that he was safe, that they were safe, at least for now. Judge's expression hardened slightly as she turned her attention to the attorneys. "Now then, let's proceed. This custody battle has already consumed 6 months and considerable court resources. Today, I expect to hear compelling arguments from both sides, and I expect all parties to conduct themselves with dignity and respect. This child has been through enough." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Emma felt it like a physical pressure in her chest. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter, the air seemed thinner, and the walls seemed closer. Her breathing quickened, and Max immediately adjusted his position, pressing more firmly against her legs. This was it. The battle for her future was about to begin, and Emma had no idea which parent would win, or what it would cost her when they did. All she knew was that she needed Max beside her, and she needed to hold on tight to whatever pieces of herself she could protect. Judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack that made Emma jump. "Let's begin. The court calls Jennifer to the witness stand," announced Mr. Santos, Emma's mother's attorney. His voice echoed through the courtroom with a formality that made everything feel even more surreal. Jennifer stood slowly, smoothing down her modest navy dress with trembling hands. Emma watched her mother walk toward the witness stand, noticing how Jennifer's steps were careful and measured, as if she were walking on ice that might crack beneath her at any moment. When Jennifer placed her hand on the Bible to be sworn in, Emma could see her mother's fingers shaking so badly that the bailiff had to steady the book. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," Jennifer whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please state your full name for the record," Mr. Santos began gently, standing at a respectful distance. "Jennifer. And you are the mother of Emma, correct?" "Yes, she's my whole world." Jennifer's eyes immediately filled with tears, and she fumbled in her purse for a tissue. Emma felt her own throat tighten watching her mother struggle to maintain composure. Mr. Santos nodded sympathetically and began walking Jennifer through the basics. Her relationship with Emma, their daily routine, Emma's school performance, her medical needs. Jennifer's voice grew steadier as she spoke about the mundane details of their life together. The way Emma liked her sandwiches cut diagonally, how she still needed her love of drawing horses, her fear of thunderstorms. But then Mr. Santos's tone shifted, becoming more serious. "Mrs., I need you to tell the court about the night of March 15th, 2022. I know this is difficult, but it's important that Judge understands the full context of Emma's current condition." Jennifer's face went pale. She clutched the tissue in her hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Across the courtroom, Michael leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed in confusion. Emma felt Max shift beneath her hand, sensing the change in the room's energy. "Take your time," Mr. Santos encouraged. Jennifer took a shaky breath and began. It was a Tuesday night. Michael was in Seattle for a software conference. He traveled a lot back then for work. Emma was 4 years old. We'd had dinner, given her a bath, read her favorite book about the caterpillar. She'd just fallen asleep in her room. Jennifer paused, her voice cracking. "I was in the kitchen, cleaning up dishes, when I heard the sound of breaking glass from the back door." The courtroom was completely silent except for the soft scratching of the court reporter's machine. Even Judge had stopped writing and was listening intently. "At first I thought maybe a tree branch had fallen or an animal had knocked something over. But then I heard voices, men's voices and footsteps, heavy boots on our hardwood floors." Jennifer's hands were shaking visibly now. "I knew immediately what was happening. We were being robbed. I ran to Emma's room, scooped her out of bed, and we hid in my bedroom closet." Emma remembered that night in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror. The darkness. Her mother's hand clamped over her mouth to keep her quiet. The sound of strangers' voices, angry and aggressive, moving through their home. The smell of her mother's fierce sweat. The way Jennifer had whispered prayers over and over while holding Emma so tight it hurt. "How long were you in that closet?" Mr. Santos asked softly. 4 hours and 17 minutes. Jennifer's voice was flat now, reciting facts as if from a distance. "I had my phone with me. I called 911 right away, but we lived in a rural area outside Dallas. The nearest police station was 23 minutes away, and there were multiple calls that night. The dispatcher told me to stay hidden and stay quiet, so we did." "What did you hear during those 4 hours?" "Everything." Jennifer closed her eyes and tears streamed down her face. "We heard them destroying our home, breaking furniture, yelling at each other, laughing. They found my jewelry box, my grandmother's pearls, my wedding ring from Michael. They took the TV, the laptops, anything valuable. At one point, one of them came into our bedroom. He stood right outside the closet door. I could see his shadow through the crack." Emma was trembling in my arms, and I was terrified she would make a sound, that he would find us. Michael's face had gone ashen. He was gripping the edge of the table in front of him, his knuckles white. Karen sat perfectly still beside him, her expression unreadable. "Emma was only 4 years old," Mr. Santos emphasized. "What was her response during and after this incident?" Jennifer wiped her eyes and looked directly at the judge. "She didn't make a sound the entire time we were in that closet, not one sound. It was like she understood that our lives depended on her silence. But afterward," Jennifer's voice broke completely. "Afterward, she didn't speak at all. For 2 weeks, my daughter didn't say a single word. She wouldn't leave my side. She couldn't sleep unless I was in the room with her. She started wetting the bed again. She would check every closet, every door, every window multiple times before she could relax." "And did you seek professional help for Emma?" "Immediately. We started seeing Dr., a child psychologist who specializes in trauma. Emma was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder at 4 years old." Jennifer's voice was filled with anguish. "Doctor worked with her twice a week for a year. We tried play therapy, art therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. Some things helped, but Emma was still having nightmares, still anxious, still afraid. Mr. Santos pulled a document from his folder. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence the psychological evaluation from Dr. dated June 2023. He handed copies to the judge and to Michael's attorney. Judge accepted the document and began reading, her expression growing more serious with each page. Mr. Santos continued, when was the first time you noticed that Max's presence specifically helped Emma's symptoms? Jennifer's face softened for the first time since taking the stand. We got Max when Emma was 5. He wasn't originally a service dog, just a puppy from a local breeder, but I noticed immediately that Emma was calmer around him. She would talk to Max when she wouldn't talk to anyone else. She slept better when he was in her room. When she had nightmares, he would somehow sense it and would go to her before she even woke up screaming. And what happened next? I contacted Paws for Purpose, an organization here in Texas that trains psychiatric service dogs for children. They evaluated both Emma and Max, and they said he had the perfect temperament for training. So we enrolled him in their program. It took 8 months of intensive training, but Max became certified as a psychiatric service dog specifically for Emma's PTSD. Can you describe for the court what Max is trained to do? Jennifer turned to look at Emma and Max sitting in the gallery, and her expression was filled with gratitude. He's trained to detect changes in Emma's heart rate, breathing patterns, and body language that indicate she's about to have a panic attack or dissociative episode. He can sense it before she's even consciously aware it's happening. When he detects these changes, he performs what's called grounding behaviors, deep pressure therapy, tactile stimulation, maintaining eye contact. He interrupts the anxiety spiral before it becomes a full crisis. Mr. Santos nodded. Has Max ever prevented Emma from harming herself? Yes. Jennifer's voice was barely a whisper. 3 times. Once she was so deep in a dissociative state that she was banging her head against the wall, and she didn't even realize she was doing it. Max physically blocked her and wouldn't let her continue. Another time, during a particularly bad nightmare, she was scratching at her arms until they bled. Max woke me up by barking and pawing at my door, something he's trained to do in emergencies. The courtroom was completely silent. Even Michael's attorney, who had been preparing to object multiple times, sat still, absorbing the gravity of what was being said. Mrs., why didn't you disclose the full extent of Emma's condition in the initial custody filings? Jennifer's face crumpled. Because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I admitted how severe her PTSD was, if I admitted that she sometimes needs intervention to keep her safe, that Michael's attorneys would paint me as negligent, that they'd say I wasn't protecting her properly or that I was making her worse by being overprotective. I thought if I just presented the basics, that she has anxiety and needs a service dog, that would be enough. I was wrong. I should have been completely honest from the start. Your Honor, Mr. Santos said, turning to Judge, Mrs. has prepared additional medical documentation, including recent evaluations, incident reports, and training certifications for Max. We'd like to submit these as evidence. Before the judge could respond, Michael's attorney, Ms. Mercer, stood up sharply. Objection, Your Honor. This is a complete ambush. We were not provided with any of this additional documentation during discovery. If Mrs. has been hiding the true extent of her daughter's condition, that speaks to her credibility and her fitness as a parent. The courtroom erupted into controlled chaos as both attorneys began arguing. Emma felt her chest tighten, her breathing becoming shallow. The raised voices, the tension, the anger, it was all too much. Max immediately stood and pressed against her legs, but Emma could feel herself starting to slip away, retreating into that dark place in her mind where nothing could hurt her. Judge's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Enough, we will take a 15-minute recess. Mrs., please step down. Counsel, I will review this documentation and make a determination about its admissibility when we reconvene. This court is in recess. As everyone stood, Jennifer rushed to Emma's side, wrapping her daughter in her arms. But Emma barely felt it. She was already disappearing into the shadows of her own mind, and this time she wasn't sure Max could bring her back. The 15-minute recess felt like an eternity. Emma sat in a small witness room adjacent to the courtroom, her mother's arms wrapped around her while Max lay across her feet, his weight grounding her back to reality. Jennifer stroked Emma's hair and whispered reassurances, but Emma could feel her mother's heart racing, could sense the fear radiating from her like heat from a fire. Mr. Santos paced near the door, checking his watch repeatedly. "We need to be prepared for Mercer to come out swinging," he muttered. "She's going to paint Michael as the stable parent and suggest that Emma's condition is being exaggerated or even caused by Jennifer's anxiety." "That's not true," Jennifer said fiercely, though her voice wavered. "Emma's trauma is real. It's documented. They can't just dismiss it." "They can try," Mr. Santos replied grimly, "and they will." When the bailiff knocked on the door to signal that court was reconvening, Emma felt her stomach drop. Max immediately stood, positioning himself beside her as they walked back into the courtroom. The air felt different now, charged with tension and anticipation. Michael sat rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched so tight that Emma could see the muscle twitching. Karen whispered something in his ear, but he didn't acknowledge her, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge returned to the bench. Her expression was unreadable, but Emma noticed she'd placed Jennifer's additional documentation in a separate folder, which suggested she'd at least reviewed it during the recess. "Please be seated," Judge said, settling into her chair. "I've reviewed the additional materials submitted by Mrs. Counsel. While I have concerns about the timing of this disclosure, the documentation appears legitimate and relevant to the child's welfare. I'm going to allow it into evidence, but Ms. Mercer, you'll have full opportunity to address these materials in your cross-examination and in presenting your client's case." Ms. Mercer stood, her expression sharp. "Thank you, Your Honor. The defense calls Michael James to the stand." Michael rose from his seat with the confidence of a man who believed he was doing the right thing. He was tall, fit, and carried himself with the self-assurance that came from years in the tech industry, where he'd built a successful career through logic, strategy, and determination. As he walked to the witness stand, he glanced briefly at Emma, and she thought she saw something soften in his eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by the businessman mask he wore so well. After being sworn in, Michael settled into the witness chair, crossing his ankle over his knee in a casual pose that seemed almost too relaxed for the gravity of the situation. Ms. Mercer began, "Thank you for being here today. Can you tell the court about your relationship with your daughter, Emma?" Michael's face transformed, genuine emotion breaking through his composed exterior. "Emma is my little girl. I love her more than anything in this world. I've been there for every important moment in her life, her first steps, her first words, her first day of school. I've coached her soccer team, helped with her homework, read her bedtime stories. I'm her father, and I want what's best for her." "And what do you believe is best for Emma?" "Stability, structure, a normal childhood." Michael leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Emma is a smart, resilient kid. She's been through something traumatic, I understand that now, and I'm angry that Jennifer never told me the full extent of what happened that night. I was in Seattle, completely unaware that my family was in danger. If I'd known how serious it was, I would have come home immediately. I would have been there for them." "Why do you believe you should have primary custody of Emma?" Michael took a deep breath. "Because I can provide her with the kind of environment where she can heal and grow. I have a stable job as a senior software engineer at TechCore Solutions. I make a comfortable income, significantly more than Jennifer's salary as a part-time dental hygienist. And my wife Karen is excited to be a mother figure to Emma. We've bought a beautiful home in Estates, 4 bedrooms, a big backyard, excellent schools. It's the kind of place where kids ride their bikes and play outside until the streetlights come on." Emma felt her chest tighten. Her father was describing a life that sounded perfect on paper, but it wasn't her life. It was someone else's life, a life where she would have to pretend to be a different girl, a normal girl who wasn't afraid of closets and unexpected noises. Mister, you've heard your ex-wife's testimony about Emma's PTSD and her reliance on the service dog Max. What are your thoughts on that? This was where Michael's expression changed. His jaw tightened, and Emma could see frustration flashing in his eyes. I think Jennifer means well, but I believe she's made Emma too dependent on therapy and that dog. Children are resilient. They bounce back from trauma if you let them. But if you constantly remind them that they're victims, if you treat them like they're fragile and broken, then that's what they become. Jennifer made a small, wounded sound beside Emma, and Mr. Santos placed a restraining hand on her arm. I'm not saying Emma doesn't need support, Michael continued. I'm saying she needs the right kind of support. She needs to learn coping mechanisms that don't involve relying on an animal. What happens when that dog gets old or sick or dies? Is Emma going to fall apart? That's not healthy. That's not preparing her for life. Mister, are you suggesting that Emma should not have Max? Michael shifted in his seat, and for the first time he looked uncomfortable. I'm suggesting that Emma needs to learn to function without constant accommodation for her anxiety. In my home, she would have structure, routine, and expectations. She would go to therapy, yes, but she would also be encouraged to push through her fears, to build confidence, to be strong. And what role would Max play in your home? The silence that followed was deafening. Michael glanced at Karen, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. Karen has severe allergies to dogs. We've consulted with 3 different allergists, and they've all confirmed that having a dog in the home would cause serious health issues for her. We've already identified a wonderful family, the Hendersons, who live 2 streets over, who would be happy to take Max. Emma could visit him anytime she wants. The courtroom erupted. Jennifer gasped audibly, and Mr. Santos had to physically hold her in her seat. Emma felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. Visit Max. Like he was just a pet she could see on weekends. Max wasn't a pet. He was her lifeline, her protector, the only thing that kept her from drowning in her own fear. Order, Judge Gavel cracked sharply. There will be order in this courtroom. Ms. Mercer continued smoothly, as if she hadn't just dropped a bomb. Mister, I know this is a difficult position to be in, but can you explain your reasoning? It's not about what I want, Michael said, and he actually sounded sincere. It's about what's realistic. Karen is going to be Emma's stepmother. She would be helping to raise Emma, taking care of her daily needs. It's not fair to ask Karen to compromise her health, and it's not fair to Emma to put her in a situation where there's tension between her stepmother and her dog. The Hendersons are good people. They have 2 kids around Emma's age. Max would be happy there, and Emma could see him regularly. Have you discussed this plan with Emma? Not yet. I wanted to wait until the custody arrangement was settled. I didn't want to upset her unnecessarily. Emma's hands were trembling so badly that Max stood up, pressing against her legs. She could feel the panic rising in her chest like water filling her lungs. Her father was going to take Max away. He was going to separate them. The one constant in her life, the one thing that kept her safe, was going to be given to strangers because Karen claimed to have allergies that Emma had never seen evidence of during their visits. Ms. Mercer said, what would you say to critics who might argue that separating Emma from her service dog is cruel or harmful? Michael's expression hardened. I would say that those critics don't understand the difference between short-term discomfort and long-term growth. Yes, Emma would be upset at first. Change is hard for everyone, especially children, but children adapt. They're more resilient than we give them credit for. Emma would adjust to her new home, her new school, her new routine. She would make friends, join activities, develop confidence. And she would learn that she's stronger than she thinks she is, that she doesn't need a dog to get through life. In your professional opinion, as someone who works in technology and problem solving, what would you say is the root cause of Emma's continued struggles? Michael leaned back, warming to the topic. Jennifer's approach has been to accommodate Emma's anxiety rather than challenge it. Every time Emma shows fear, Jennifer reinforces it by rushing to comfort her, by bringing in Max, by treating her like she's made of glass. That's not parenting, that's enabling. In my home, Emma would be loved and supported, but she would also be expected to try new things, to face her fears in age-appropriate ways, to build resilience. Thank you, Mr. No further questions at this time. Judge turned to Mr. Santos. Cross-examination. Mr. Santos stood, and Emma could see the controlled anger in his posture. Mister, you've stated that you believe Emma needs to push through her fears and be strong. Are you aware that post-traumatic stress disorder is a recognized medical condition, not a character flaw? Of course, I'm aware of that. And are you aware that Max is not a pet, but a certified medical device under the Americans with Disabilities Act? Michael hesitated. I understand he has some training, yes. Some training. Mr. Santos's voice was sharp. Max underwent 8 months of intensive training with Paws for Purpose, one of the most respected service dog organizations in Texas. He is certified to detect physiological changes in Emma that indicate an impending panic attack or dissociative episode. He has literally saved your daughter from harming herself on multiple occasions. And you want to give him to the neighbors because your wife claims to have allergies. That's not fair. Has your wife Karen provided medical documentation of these allergies? Have you submitted any allergist reports to this court? Michael's face flushed. We have appointments scheduled. Appointments scheduled, Mr. Santos repeated incredulously. So you're asking this court to separate a traumatized child from her medical support animal based on unverified allergies that may or may not exist. Objection. Ms. Mercer was on her feet, argumentative and badgering the witness. Sustained, Judge said, but her expression suggested she was interested in the answer. Mr. Santos changed tactics. Mister, you mentioned that you were in Seattle during the home invasion. How often were you traveling for work during that period? I don't see how that's relevant. Please answer the question. Michael's jaw clenched. 2 to 3 times per month, typically for 2 to 4 days at a time. So you were absent from the home approximately 1/3 of the time. I was providing for my family. And now you're asking for primary custody, despite the fact that your job still requires frequent travel. I've reduced my travel significantly, and Karen would be there when I'm away. Karen, who has known Emma for less than a year and wants to remove her service dog. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Michael's confident demeanor was cracking, and Emma could see the anger building in his eyes, the same anger that used to scare her when her parents fought. But before Mr. Santos could continue, Emma felt it happening. The walls were closing in. The voices were getting louder. Her vision was tunneling. She was slipping away, retreating into that dark closet in her mind where she'd learned to hide from danger. And this time she wasn't sure anyone, not even Max, could bring her back. The courtroom continued its brutal dance of accusations and counterarguments, but Emma was no longer fully present to witness it. She sat on the hard wooden bench, her small body rigid, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the judge's bench where reality seemed to blur and fade. Max, ever vigilant, had noticed the change immediately. His ears were pinned forward, his body tense with alertness. His amber eyes locked on Emma's face with an intensity that would have alarmed anyone who understood what it meant. Mr. Santos was still cross-examining Michael, his voice sharp with controlled outrage. Mister, let me ask you this. If Emma were diabetic and required insulin, would you suggest she push through her need for medication to build resilience? Michael's face reddened. That's not the same thing at all. Isn't it? Both are medical conditions. Both require medical interventions. The only difference is that one intervention is a medication and the other is a highly trained service animal. Why do you consider one legitimate and the other negotiable? Because, Michael struggled to find words. Because I believe Emma can overcome this with the right support and environment. PTSD isn't a life sentence. People recover from trauma. People recover from trauma with appropriate treatment, Mr. Santos countered. Treatment that, in Emma's case, includes Max. You're not a psychologist, are you, mister? No, but you're not a trauma specialist. No. You haven't completed any training or education in childhood PTSD. No, but I'm her father. I know my daughter. Mr. Santos paused, letting the silence stretch. Do you? Because sitting in this courtroom today, I've learned several things about Emma that you clearly didn't know. You didn't know about the severity of the home invasion trauma. You didn't know about the dissociative episodes. You didn't know that she's had to be physically prevented from self-harm. You didn't know that Max has been trained specifically to detect and interrupt life-threatening panic attacks. So I ask you again, mister, do you really know your daughter? The words hung in the air like a slap. Michael's composure finally cracked, and Emma could see the hurt and anger flashing across his face. The same expression he'd worn during the worst fights with her mother. The ones that had happened behind closed doors but had been loud enough for Emma to hear every word. I know that my daughter deserves better than to be treated like she's broken. Michael's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. I know that she's being coddled and made dependent on an animal instead of being taught how to be a strong, independent person. I know that if she stays with Jennifer, she'll grow up thinking she's a victim, that she's damaged, that she needs special accommodations for the rest of her life. Objection. Ms. Mercer tried to intervene, but Michael wasn't done. I know that I love my daughter, and I want her to have a normal life. Is that so wrong? Is it wrong to want your child to be happy and healthy and not defined by one terrible night that happened 3 years ago? The courtroom erupted into chaos. Jennifer was openly crying now. Mr. Santos was trying to speak over the commotion. Ms. Mercer was objecting strenuously, and Judge was pounding her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. But Emma heard none of it. The voices had become a roaring in her ears, like ocean waves or rushing wind. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her temples, in her fingertips. One terrible night. That's what her father had called it. One terrible night, as if it were something that should have ended when the sun came up. As if the fear had stayed in that closet instead of following her everywhere she went. As if she could just decide to stop being afraid, stop checking doors and windows, stop waking up in the middle of the night, convinced that someone was in the house. Her father didn't understand. He would never understand. And if he got custody, he would take Max away, and Emma would be alone in that big house in estates with Corinne's fake smile and her father's disappointment, and no one to help her when the darkness came. The panic was rising in her chest now, a tidal wave of terror that threatened to swallow her whole. Emma's breathing became rapid and shallow, her lungs unable to pull in enough air. Her hands began to tingle, then go numb. The courtroom around her started to fracture and distort, faces becoming unfamiliar, sounds becoming distant and muffled. She was falling, tumbling backward through time and space, back to that closet, back to that night, back to the worst moment of her life. This was the dissociation that doctor had explained to her mother in clinical terms. The mind's emergency shutdown when the present becomes indistinguishable from past trauma. When the body's fear response is so overwhelming that the only escape is to mentally leave the situation entirely. For Emma, it felt like drowning, like being pulled underwater where everything was dark and cold, and she couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't call for help. Max knew. He had been trained to recognize the physiological changes that preceded this moment, the elevated heart rate, the change in breathing pattern, the muscle tension, the 1,000 tiny signals that Emma's body broadcast when it was about to shut down. He had been monitoring her throughout the entire proceeding, but now his training kicked into high gear. The golden retriever stood up, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He positioned himself directly in front of Emma, his substantial body blocking her view of the courtroom chaos, creating a physical barrier between her and the source of her distress. But Emma's eyes were unfocused, staring through him rather than at him. She was too far gone, too deep in the dissociative state for normal grounding techniques to work. This was an emergency. Emma needed immediate intervention, but she was unable to verbally communicate her distress. Her voice was locked somewhere inside her, trapped behind the wall of panic and trauma. Doctor and Max's trainer had anticipated this possibility. They had taught Emma a backup plan, a way to ask for help when words were impossible. With the last shred of conscious control she had, Emma lifted her trembling right hand. The movement was small, barely noticeable in the chaos of the courtroom. Her fingers shook as she touched her right ear, once, twice. The gesture looked like nothing more than a nervous fidget, like she was tucking her hair behind her ear. But it wasn't. It was a signal, a secret language between Emma and Max that no one else in the courtroom understood. Then with tremendous effort, Emma tapped her chest. 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. The motion was weak, her hand barely making contact with her body, but it was enough. Max's entire demeanor transformed in an instant. The service dog went from alert monitoring mode to full crisis intervention protocol. His training had covered dozens of scenarios, hundreds of possible responses, but this signal, 2 touches to the ear, 3 taps to the chest, meant one thing: emergency medical alert. Emma was in immediate danger of complete psychological shutdown. The dog moved with a speed and precision that was startling. He placed his front paws on Emma's shoulders, gently but firmly, forcing her to feel his weight to acknowledge his physical presence. His face was inches from hers, his warm breath on her cheek, his amber eyes locked onto her glazed, unfocused stare. He began to whine, not a distressed sound, but a deliberate vocalization designed to cut through her dissociation and anchor her attention. When Emma didn't respond, Max escalated. He began licking her face, her hands, any exposed skin he could reach. Not affectionate dog kisses, but purposeful, repetitive tactile stimulation meant to override her psychological shutdown with immediate sensory input. His large body pressed against her legs, providing deep pressure therapy. He was doing everything in his power to pull her back from the edge, to remind her body that she was here now in this moment, and that she was safe. But it was the sound that finally broke through the chaos and captured everyone's attention. Max began to bark. Loud, urgent, insistent barks that echoed through the courtroom like alarm bells. Service dogs were trained to work silently in public spaces. Barking was reserved only for the most critical emergencies, when their handler was in immediate danger and needed help right now. Judge's gavel, which had been pounding repeatedly in a futile attempt to restore order, froze in midair. Her head snapped toward the sound, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. The little girl, pale and unresponsive, and the service dog performing what was clearly emergency medical intervention. "Stop!" Judge's voice cut through the courtroom like a knife. "Everyone stop immediately." The courtroom fell into shocked silence. Michael, who had been in the middle of an impassioned defense of his parenting philosophy, turned to look at his daughter. The color drained from his face as he saw Emma's condition, the blank stare, the shallow breathing, the way she seemed to be looking at something far beyond the courtroom walls. "Oh my God," he whispered, "Emma." Jennifer was already moving, launching herself from her seat with a mother's instinct for her child in distress. But Mr. Santos caught her arm, holding her back. "Let the dog work," he said urgently. "Max knows what to do. If we crowd her now, it could make it worse." Max continued his intervention protocol, his body creating a protective cocoon around Emma. He placed his large golden head in her lap, applying firm, steady pressure. He nudged her hands with his nose, trying to get her to touch him, to engage with the physical world. His tail, which had been wagging gently throughout most of the proceeding, was now still, another sign that he was in full working mode, every ounce of his attention focused on his handler. The bailiff had moved closer, his hand on his radio, ready to call for medical assistance. Judge had risen from her bench, her face etched with concern. Even Ms. Mercer and Karen had stopped their whispered consultation to watch the unfolding crisis. Emma's fingers, still resting against her chest where she'd given the signal, began to move. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they reached out and touched Max's fur. The contact seemed to trigger something in her brain, a small connection back to reality. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow slightly. Her eyes, which had been staring into the middle distance, flickered with recognition. Max sensed the change immediately. His tail began to move again, a gentle wag of encouragement. He licked her hands again, his tongue warm and rough against her cold skin. He maintained the deep pressure against her legs, grounding her in the physical sensation of his weight, his warmth, his presence. "Emma, sweetheart, can you hear me?" Jennifer's voice was desperate, breaking with emotion. But Emma couldn't respond. Not yet. She was somewhere between that terrible closet and this terrible courtroom, struggling to find her way back to the present. And as Judge watched this medical emergency unfold in her courtroom, this child literally coming apart at the seams while her parents fought over her future, she realized with absolute clarity that this case was far more serious than anyone had initially understood. This wasn't just a custody dispute. This was a child's life hanging in the balance. "Someone call 911. Karen's voice cut through the stunned silence, high-pitched and panicked. She was halfway out of her seat, her phone already in her hand. "No," Jennifer's voice was sharp, commanding. She took a step toward Emma but maintained the distance Mr. Santos had advised. "Don't call an ambulance. Not yet. Let Max do his work. Emma has been through this before. If we overwhelm her with paramedics and strangers, it will make everything worse." Judge's eyes darted between the mother and the child, her decades of courtroom experience warring with her instinct to intervene in what appeared to be a medical emergency. "Mrs., your daughter appears to be in severe distress. Are you certain we shouldn't?" "Your Honor, please." Jennifer's voice cracked with desperation and authority in equal measure. "I know this looks terrifying, but Emma is having a dissociative episode triggered by acute PTSD. This is exactly what Max was trained for. If we trust his training, if we give him time, he can bring her back. And if he can't," the judge's question hung heavy in the air, "then we call for help, but please give him a chance. Give her a chance." The courtroom held its collective breath as Max continued his intervention. The golden retriever had shifted position, now lying partially across Emma's lap, his weight providing constant, reassuring pressure. His head was tucked under her chin, and he was making small, rhythmic movements, breathing deeply, intentionally, his chest rising and falling in an exaggerated pattern meant to guide Emma's own erratic breathing back to normal. It was working. Slowly, incrementally, Emma's gasping breaths began to sync with Max's steady rhythm. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The dog's warmth was seeping into her cold hands, his heartbeat strong and steady against her chest. These physical sensations, real, immediate, undeniable, were creating thin threads connecting her back to the present moment. Michael had moved to the edge of his seat, his earlier confidence completely shattered. His hands gripped the table in front of him so tightly that his knuckles had turned bone white. "Emma," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Baby girl, please come back." It was perhaps the first time in the entire proceeding that he'd spoken to his daughter rather than about her. Emma's eyes, which had been vacant and unseeing, began to focus. She blinked slowly, like someone waking from a deep sleep. Her fingers, which had been limp and unresponsive, curled into Max's thick golden fur, gripping it like a lifeline. A small, choked sound escaped her throat, not quite a word, but the first vocalization she'd made since the episode began. "That's it, Emma," Jennifer encouraged softly, tears streaming down her face. "That's it, sweetheart, you're here, you're safe. Max has you." Judge sank back into her chair, one hand pressed against her chest as if trying to calm her own racing heart. She had presided over thousands of cases in her career, criminal trials, civil disputes, countless custody battles. but she had never witnessed anything quite like this. The raw, visceral reality of childhood trauma playing out in her courtroom was more powerful than any testimony, any expert report, any legal argument could ever be. "Mrs., the judge said quietly, I think we need to take a longer recess. Is there somewhere private where Emma can recover?" "The witness preparation room," Mr. Santos suggested immediately. "It's quiet, private, away from all of this." "Bailiff, please escort Mrs. and Emma to that location. Take all the time you need." Judge's voice was gentle now, stripped of its usual judicial formality. "Mrs., does Emma need anything? Water? Medical attention?" Jennifer shook her head, already moving toward her daughter. "Just time and Max, that's all she needs. Thank you, Your Honor." As Jennifer carefully helped Emma to her feet, the little girl still clinging to Max's collar, still unsteady on her legs, Michael stood abruptly. "Can I?" His voice broke. "Can I come with her? I'm her father. I should be there." Jennifer turned to look at him, and the expression on her face was complex: anger, pity, exhaustion, and something else. Understanding, perhaps. "Not right now, Michael. Please. She needs to calm down, and seeing you might trigger another episode. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's true." Michael's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like he might argue. But then his shoulders sagged in defeat. He nodded slowly and sat back down, covering his face with his hands. As Emma, Jennifer, and Max left the courtroom, the little girl leaning heavily on her mother, the dog pressed against her side, Judge turned her attention to the attorneys and remaining parties. "We're going to take a 30-minute recess," she announced. "But before we do, I want to make something abundantly clear to everyone in this courtroom. What we just witnessed was not dramatics. That was not manipulation or exaggeration. That was a medical emergency. A 7-year-old child had a psychological crisis severe enough that she required immediate intervention from a trained medical service animal. Let that sink in." The judge's gaze moved from Ms. Mercer to Michael to Karen, each one in turn. "I've read hundreds of custody cases. I've seen parents make all kinds of arguments about what's best for their children. But what I just saw tells me more about this child's needs than weeks of testimony ever could." Ms. Mercer stood carefully. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we would argue that what you witnessed is evidence that Emma has been made overly dependent on the dog. If she'd been taught proper coping mechanisms." "Counselor," Judge's voice was ice, "I'm going to stop you right there. I watched that child give a deliberate signal, a medical alert, to her service animal when she was unable to verbally communicate her distress. That's not dependence. That's not weakness. That's a highly intelligent adaptive response to disability. That child found a way to ask for help when her own voice failed her. And that dog, that remarkable animal, knew exactly what to do to prevent a complete psychological collapse." The judge paused, letting her words resonate through the silent courtroom. "I'm not a medical professional, but I've seen enough in my career to recognize when a child is genuinely suffering. And I've seen enough to recognize when an intervention is working. Whatever Max is, pet, medical device, emotional support, he just prevented what could have been a catastrophic outcome." Michael finally looked up, his eyes red and devastated. "I didn't know," he said hoarsely. "I didn't know it was this bad. Jennifer never told me." "Because you never asked," Mr. Santos interjected sharply. "You assumed. You dismissed. You minimized. And when your ex-wife tried to explain, you accused her of being overprotective and making Emma dependent." "That's enough," Judge said firmly. "We're not going to litigate this right now. Mister, I can see that you're genuinely shaken by what you've witnessed. Good. You should be. Because whether you end up with custody or not, you need to understand the reality of your daughter's condition. This isn't something she's going to grow out of. This isn't weakness or poor parenting. This is a legitimate, serious medical condition that requires ongoing treatment and accommodation." She turned to her bailiff. "I want you to contact Dr. Sarah. She's a pediatric trauma specialist who consults with this court. I want her here within the hour if possible. I need an expert evaluation of what we just witnessed and what it means for this custody determination." "Your Honor, that's highly irregular," Ms. Mercer began. "I don't care if it's irregular, Counselor. A child just had a medical crisis in my courtroom while we argued about her future. I'm not making a decision about this custody arrangement without fully understanding what I'm deciding. If you want to object, feel free to note it for the record, but I'm ordering the evaluation regardless." The bailiff nodded and immediately stepped out to make the call. In the witness preparation room down the hall, Emma was curled up on a small sofa, wrapped in her mother's arms, with Max stretched out beside them. The little girl's breathing had finally returned to normal, and her eyes had lost that terrible vacant quality. But she looked utterly exhausted, her face pale and drawn. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered, her voice small and hoarse. "I'm sorry, Mama. I tried to hold it together. I tried so hard." "Oh, sweetheart, no." Jennifer pressed kisses to the top of Emma's head, rocking her gently. "You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. You were so brave in there. You found a way to tell Max what you needed when you couldn't use words. That's incredible, Emma. That's smart and brave and amazing." "Daddy wants to take Max away." Emma's voice broke on a sob. "He said Max could live with the neighbors, but Max isn't just my friend, Mama. He's my. He's your lifeline," Jennifer finished softly. "I know, baby, I know, and we're going to fight for him. The judge saw what happened. She saw what Max did for you. She understands now." Emma buried her face in Max's fur, and the dog turned his head to gently lick her ear, a comfort gesture, not a medical intervention. Just a reminder that he was there, that he would always be there, no matter what any judge or lawyer or parent decided. "I don't want to live with Daddy and Corinne," Emma whispered into Max's fur. "I know that makes me bad. I know I'm supposed to love both my parents the same. But I can't go there, Mama. I can't. If they take Max away, I won't be able to." "Don't think about that right now. Just breathe. Just be here with me and Max. That's all you need to do right now." But as Jennifer held her daughter and felt the little girl's heart still racing against her chest, she knew with terrible clarity that everything hinged on what happened next. The judge had seen the truth today, the raw, undeniable reality of Emma's condition. The question was whether that would be enough to override Michael's arguments about stability and structure and normal childhood experiences. The question was whether the court would recognize that for Emma, normal was survival, and survival required Max. Outside in the hallway, Dr. Sarah was being briefed by the bailiff on what had transpired. The pediatric trauma specialist listened with growing concern, her professional mind already analyzing the situation and preparing her questions. When she reached the witness preparation room and knocked softly on the door, she had no idea that her evaluation in the next hour would change the trajectory of not just this case, but family law regarding service animals across the entire state of Texas. Dr. Sarah entered the witness preparation room with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent 20 years working with traumatized children. She was a petite woman in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and warm brown eyes that had witnessed more childhood suffering than most people could imagine. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm and moved with deliberate slowness, understanding that sudden movements could be triggering for a child in Emma's state. "Mrs. I'm doctor. Judge asked me to evaluate the situation." Her voice was gentle, professional, carefully calibrated to be reassuring without being condescending. "May I come in?" Jennifer looked up from where she sat with Emma curled against her. Her eyes were red-rimmed and cautious, protective instincts on high alert. "Will this take long? Emma's exhausted. She needs rest, not more interrogation." "I understand completely," Doctor said, setting her portfolio on a nearby chair and lowering herself to sit at Emma's eye level rather than standing over her. "I'm not here to interrogate anyone. I just need to observe and ask a few questions if Emma feels up to it. If she doesn't, that's perfectly fine. Her comes first." Max, who had been resting beside Emma, lifted his head and regarded Doctor with calm assessment. The dog's training included learning to recognize medical professionals and other safe individuals, and something in Doctor's demeanor seemed to pass his evaluation. His tail gave a small, polite wag before he returned his attention to Emma. "Emma," Doctor said softly, "my name is Doctor, but you can call me Sarah if you'd like. I work with kids who have been through scary things, and I help judges understand what those kids need to feel safe. Is it okay if I sit here and talk with you for a little bit?" Emma peeked out from where her face had been buried in her mother's shoulder. Her eyes were puffy from crying, and she looked small and fragile in a way that made Doctor's professional heart ache. "Are you going to make me go live with my dad?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "No, sweetheart, I don't make those decisions. Judge does. I just help her understand what's happening. Can you tell me what you were feeling before Max helped you in the courtroom?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working through Max's fur in a rhythmic, self-soothing pattern. "It was like drowning," she finally said. "Like I was underwater and everything was far away and I couldn't breathe right, and the voices got all fuzzy and wrong." Doctor nodded, making careful notes in her portfolio. "That must have been very frightening. What did you do when you realized you were feeling that way?" "I did the signal, the one taught me," Emma demonstrated, touching her ear twice and tapping her chest 3 times. "It's for when I can't talk anymore, when the words get stuck." "That's a very smart thing to do. You found a way to ask for help even when speaking was impossible. That shows real strength, Emma." Doctor glanced at Max, then back to Emma. "How long have you had Max?" 2 years. He was just a puppy when we got him, but then he went to training school." Emma's voice grew slightly stronger as she talked about her dog. "Says he's the dog she ever trained. He knows when I'm going to have a bad time before I even know it. He can tell from my heartbeat and my breathing and stuff." "Has Max ever helped you before like he did today?" Emma nodded. "Lots of times. Sometimes at school when there's a fire drill and the alarm is too loud. Sometimes at night when I have bad dreams. One time." She trailed off, looking at her mother uncertainly. "You can tell her, sweetheart," Jennifer encouraged gently. "Doctor needs to know." Emma took a shaky breath. "One time I was having a really bad dream about the bad men who came to our house, and when I woke up, I was so scared that I was hitting my head against the wall, but I didn't even know I was doing it. Max jumped on the bed and pushed himself between me and the wall, and then he started barking really loud to wake up Mama. I had a big bump on my head after, but Max stopped me from hurting myself worse." Doctor's expression remained professionally neutral, but Jennifer could see the concern flashing in her eyes as she made detailed notes. "Emma, do you remember the night the bad men came to your house?" The little girl's entire body tensed, and Max immediately responded, pressing closer against her legs. "I remember hiding in the closet with Mama. It was dark and I was really scared. Mama had her hand over my mouth so I wouldn't make noise. We stayed there for a really, really long time. I thought they were going to find us." "That sounds absolutely terrifying. Do you still think about that night?" "All the time," Emma admitted, her voice small. "Especially at night. Sometimes I check the closets to make sure no one's in them, and I can't sleep if all the doors aren't locked. And sometimes when I hear a loud noise, I think they're coming back." Doctor set down her pen and looked directly at Emma with compassionate understanding. "Emma, I want you to know something important. What you're feeling, the fear, the bad dreams, the way your body reacts to reminders of that scary night, that's not your fault. Your brain is trying to protect you because something really bad happened, and it wants to make sure it never happens again. Does that make sense?" Emma nodded slowly. "And Max," Doctor continued, reaching out slowly to let the dog sniff her hand before gently touching his head, "Max is helping your brain feel safer. He's like a bridge between the scared part of you and the safe part of you. When you're having a hard time, he helps remind your body that you're actually okay right now, even though your brain is remembering when you weren't okay. Is that how it feels?" Yeah, Emma whispered. When Max is with me, I can breathe better. I don't get stuck in the scared place as much. Doctor turned to Jennifer. Mrs., I need to ask you some difficult questions. Has Emma ever expressed thoughts of self-harm or suicide? Jennifer's face went pale, and she instinctively tightened her arms around Emma. Not in words, no, but there have been moments during severe dissociative episodes where she's been a danger to herself without realizing it. The head-banging incident Emma mentioned. Another time she was scratching at her arms until they bled, but when I stopped her, she seemed confused, like she didn't understand what she'd been doing. It's like she goes somewhere else mentally, and her body acts without her conscious awareness. And Max has intervened during these episodes. Every single time. He detects them before they escalate. I cannot emphasize enough, Dr. Max has quite literally kept my daughter alive. Doctor made extensive notes, her expression grave. She spent another 15 minutes asking questions about Emma's daily routines, her triggers, her treatment history, her relationship with both parents. She observed how Emma interacted with Max, noting the dog's constant vigilance, the way he monitored Emma's every breath and movement, the subtle adjustments he made in his positioning based on her emotional state. Finally, Doctor closed her portfolio and stood. Emma, thank you for being so brave and honest with me. You did a wonderful job answering my questions. Mrs., I have what I need. I'm going to speak with Judge now. What are you going to tell her? Jennifer's voice was tight with anxiety. Doctor's expression was serious but kind. I'm going to tell her the truth. That's all I can do. 20 minutes later, Doctor stood before Judge in the courtroom. Michael, Karen, and both attorneys had reassembled, waiting with visible tension for the expert's assessment. Emma and Jennifer remained in the witness room, giving the child time to fully recover. Judge began, thank you for responding so quickly. Please share your findings with the court. Doctor opened her portfolio. Though Emma suspected she didn't need to reference her notes, the evaluation had painted a clear picture. Your Honor, I've spent approximately 30 minutes with Emma, observing her interaction with her service dog and conducting a clinical interview. I've also reviewed the medical documentation provided by Mrs. Counsel. Based on this evaluation, I can state with professional certainty that Emma suffers from severe post-traumatic stress disorder with dissociative features. She paused, making sure she had everyone's full attention. The episode witnessed in this courtroom earlier was what we call an acute dissociative response. Emma's nervous system became so overwhelmed by perceived threat, in this case, the stress of the custody proceedings and the discussion about potentially losing her service dog, that her brain essentially shut down non-essential functions. This is not a panic attack, though it shares some features. This is a trauma response where the individual partially or completely loses connection with present reality. Michael leaned forward, his face ashen. Is this my fault, because I wasn't there that night? Doctor turned to him, her expression neutral but not unkind. Mister, trauma isn't about fault. It's about what happened to a child's developing brain during a terrifying experience. Emma's PTSD would exist regardless of your presence or absence that night. However, I will say that her recovery and management of symptoms is significantly impacted by the support system around her and the accommodations made for her disability. Disability, Ms. Mercer interjected. Doctor, isn't that term a bit extreme for a child who's simply anxious? Doctor's eyes hardened slightly. Counselor, Emma's PTSD meets every clinical criterion for a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Her condition substantially limits one or more major life activities, including but not limited to sleeping, concentrating, interacting with others, and regulating her emotional responses. This is not simply anxious. This is a chronic mental health condition that requires ongoing treatment and accommodation. She turned back to Judge. Which brings me to Max. What I observed today was nothing short of remarkable. That dog detected physiological changes in Emma that preceded her conscious awareness of the episode. He responded with a complex series of interventions: deep pressure therapy, tactile stimulation, rhythm regulation, that successfully prevented a complete psychological collapse. Without Max's intervention, Emma would likely have required emergency medical transport and possibly psychiatric hospitalization. The courtroom was completely silent. Furthermore, Doctor continued, her voice firm and authoritative, Emma has been trained to use nonverbal emergency signals when she's unable to communicate verbally. The signal I observed, 2 touches to the ear, 3 taps to the chest, is a brilliant adaptive strategy. It means that even when Emma is partially dissociated and unable to speak, she retains enough executive function to request help. Max's response to that signal was immediate, appropriate, and life-saving. Judge leaned forward. Doctor, in your professional opinion, what would happen to Emma if she were separated from Max? Doctor didn't hesitate. Your Honor, separating Emma from Max would be catastrophic. Max is not a pet. He is medical equipment, as essential to Emma's daily functioning as a wheelchair is to someone with paralysis, or as insulin is to a diabetic. Removing Max from Emma's life would eliminate her primary method of regulating her nervous system, detecting crisis before it becomes dangerous, and maintaining connection to reality during dissociative episodes. She paused, then delivered the statement that would change everything. If Emma were separated from Max, I would consider her to be at significant risk for self-harm, psychiatric hospitalization, and possible suicide. This is not hyperbole. This is clinical reality. Silence that followed Doctor's statement was suffocating. The word suicide hung in the air like a physical weight, pressing down on everyone in the courtroom. Michael's face had gone from pale to gray, and his hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the table in front of him. Karen sat frozen beside him, her carefully maintained composure cracking at the edges. Doctor, Judge said carefully, you mentioned suicide risk. Can you elaborate on that assessment? Doctor nodded gravely. Your Honor, children with severe PTSD and dissociative features are at elevated risk for self-harm and suicidal ideation, particularly when they lose their primary coping mechanism. Emma has already demonstrated instances of unintentional self-harm during dissociative episodes. Without Max's intervention, these episodes would be more frequent, more severe, and more dangerous. Additionally, the psychological impact of losing Max, whom Emma clearly views as her protector and lifeline, would constitute another major trauma layered on top of her existing PTSD. But she's 7 years old, Ms. Mercer interjected, her voice strained. Are you seriously suggesting that a 7-year-old child would attempt suicide? Doctor turned to face the attorney, and her expression was both sad and firm. Counselor, I've worked with children as young as 5 who have attempted suicide. Childhood trauma doesn't wait until a developmentally appropriate age to manifest in dangerous ways. And while Emma may not have the cognitive sophistication to plan a suicide attempt in the way an adolescent or adult might, she has already shown that during dissociative episodes, she engages in self-injurious behavior without conscious awareness. The line between unintentional self-harm and accidental death is terrifyingly thin. Michael suddenly stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I need to see her. I need to talk to my daughter, right now. Mister, please sit down, Judge said firmly. We're still on the record. I don't care about the record, Michael's voice cracked with emotion. I just listened to a doctor tell me that my little girl might kill herself if I take her dog away. Do you understand what that means? I was arguing. I was standing up there arguing that Emma needed to be stronger, that she was being coddled, that she needed to learn to cope without that dog. And all this time she was. His voice broke completely, and he sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. Oh God! What have I done? Karen placed a tentative hand on his shoulder, but Michael shrugged it off. For the first time since the proceedings began, visible tension appeared between them. Judge gave Michael a moment to compose himself before addressing Doctor again. Doctor, let's discuss the proposed custody arrangement. Mr. has requested primary custody, with Emma residing in his home where his wife, Mrs. Karen, has stated she has severe allergies to dogs. In your professional opinion, is there any scenario in which Emma could successfully transition to living primarily with her father if Max is not permitted in the home? Doctor didn't hesitate. No, Your Honor, absolutely not. There is no therapeutic intervention, no medication, no amount of preparation that would make such a transition safe for Emma. Asking her to choose between her father and her service dog would be psychologically devastating. Attempting to force her to live without Max would likely result in immediate crisis requiring hospitalization. What if Max were housed nearby, as Mr. suggested, and Emma could visit him regularly? That would not be sufficient. Max's effectiveness depends on his constant presence and his ability to detect and respond to Emma's physiological changes in real time. He can't help her manage a nightmare if he's 2 houses away. He can't interrupt a dissociative episode at school if he's left at home. Service dogs aren't part-time solutions. Ms. Mercer stood, her professional composure clearly tested. Doctor, with respect, isn't it possible that Emma has been made overly dependent on this animal because of Mrs.'s own anxiety and overprotective parenting? Couldn't a structured environment with clear boundaries and expectations help Emma develop healthier coping mechanisms? Doctor's expression hardened. Counselor, I'm going to be very direct with you. What you're suggesting is the equivalent of asking whether a child with type 1 diabetes has been made overly dependent on insulin because of parental overprotection. Emma's brain chemistry and nervous system regulation have been fundamentally altered by trauma. Max doesn't enable her dysfunction, he enables her survival. There's a critical difference. She pulled a document from her portfolio. I have here a letter from the certified service dog trainer who worked with Max and Emma for 8 months. Ms. states that Max has performed documented interventions preventing Emma from self-harm on at least 7 occasions in the past year alone. 7 times, Your Honor. That's not dependence. That's life-saving medical intervention. Judge accepted the letter and began reading, her expression growing more troubled with each line. Doctor, I need you to be completely clear with me. If I were to award primary custody to Mr. and Max were not permitted in the home, what would be your recommendation for Emma's care? Immediate psychiatric hospitalization in a facility equipped to handle pediatric trauma patients with high self-harm risk, 24-hour supervision, possible physical restraints during acute episodes, heavy medication to manage anxiety and dissociation, with significant potential side effects including cognitive dulling, weight gain, and emotional numbing. And even with all of that, I could not guarantee her safety. Doctor paused, letting the full weight of her words sink in. Or, Your Honor, Emma could continue living with her mother and Max, receive ongoing outpatient therapy, and have a reasonable chance at a relatively normal childhood. The choice seems obvious to me. Michael's shoulders were shaking. He was crying now, openly and without shame, his carefully constructed arguments crumbling around him. I didn't know, he whispered hoarsely. Jennifer, I swear to God, I didn't know it was this serious. Why didn't you tell me? From across the room, Mr. Santos stood. Your Honor, may Mrs. respond to that question? I believe it's relevant to the court's understanding of the family dynamics. Judge nodded. Bailiff, please ask Mrs. to return to the courtroom if Emma is stable enough to be left with a court officer. 5 minutes later, Jennifer entered the courtroom alone, her eyes red and swollen but her posture straight with determination. She looked at Michael, and something passed between them. Years of shared history, of love turned to resentment, of miscommunication and missed opportunities. You want to know why I didn't tell you how bad it was? Jennifer's voice was steady but laced with pain. Because every time I tried, Michael, you dismissed me. When I told you Emma was having nightmares, you said all kids have nightmares. When I said she needed therapy, you said I was making her soft. When I mentioned she was checking the locks obsessively, you said I was enabling her anxiety. You made it very clear that you thought I was the problem, that I was creating her issues by being too protective, too anxious, too present. That's not fair, Michael started. Isn't it? Jennifer's voice rose. You were traveling 3 weeks out of every month, Michael. You weren't there for the midnight panic attacks. You weren't there when she wet the bed at 6 years old because she was too afraid to get up and go to the bathroom in the dark. You weren't there when she had a complete meltdown at school because someone slammed a locker too hard and she thought the bad men were back. I was there. I was there for all of it alone, trying to help our daughter survive. And every time I reached out to you, you made me feel like I was overreacting. Tears were streaming down Jennifer's face now, but her voice remained strong. And yes, maybe I should have been more forceful. Maybe I should have dragged you to therapy appointments, made you read the medical reports, forced you to see what I was seeing. But I was exhausted, Michael. I was working part-time, managing Emma's care, going to endless doctor appointments, and trying to keep our daughter from falling apart completely. I didn't have the energy to fight you too. Michael looked at his ex-wife, really looked at her, and saw for the first time the toll that 3 years of single-handedly managing their daughter's trauma had taken. Jennifer had aged in ways that went beyond the passage of time. There was a weariness in her eyes, a tension in her shoulders, the look of someone who had been fighting a battle alone for far too long. I'm sorry, Michael said, and his voice was raw with genuine remorse. Jennifer, I'm so sorry. You're right. I wasn't there. I didn't see. I didn't listen. I thought I was helping by encouraging her to be strong, by pushing her to be normal, but I was just making everything worse, wasn't I? Not intentionally, Jennifer said quietly. I know you love Emma. I've never doubted that, but love isn't enough, Michael. She needs understanding. She needs accommodation. She needs Max. Corinne, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. I don't actually have dog allergies. Her voice was small, almost inaudible. I mean, I'm not thrilled about dogs, but I don't have allergies. That was my suggestion. I thought it would make things simpler. The courtroom went completely still. Michael turned to look at his wife with an expression of utter betrayal and disbelief. You what? I just thought, Corinne's voice was defensive now, tinged with panic. I thought if Emma couldn't have the dog, she'd adjust. She'd have to. Kids adapt, right? And I didn't want to live with a dog. I didn't want dog hair on the furniture and the smell and the mess. I thought we could present it as a medical issue and it would be cleaner, easier to argue in court. You lied, Michael said flatly. You lied about having allergies, and I based my entire custody argument on that lie. Do you understand what you've done? Do you understand that our attorney has been arguing to the court that we physically cannot accommodate Max in our home because of your health, and it was all bullshit? Ms. Mercer looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. Your Honor, I was not aware. If I had known this information was false. I'm sure you weren't, Counselor, Judge said, her voice dripping with ice. Mrs. Corinne, you do understand that lying to the court, even indirectly through your husband's testimony, constitutes perjury. Corinne's face went white. I didn't technically testify. You provided false information that was used as the basis for legal arguments regarding a child's welfare, the judge said sharply. I could hold you in contempt right now. Michael stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger and shame. Your Honor, I need to withdraw my petition for primary custody. I can't do this. I thought I was fighting for my daughter's best interests, but I was fighting based on lies and ignorance. Emma belongs with her mother. Emma belongs with Max. I see that now. Judge studied Michael carefully, assessing whether this was genuine realization or courtroom strategy. Mister, this is a significant decision. Do you want to take time to consider? No, Michael interrupted. I don't need time. I've heard enough. I've seen enough. My daughter had a medical crisis in this courtroom because the stress of potentially losing her service dog triggered a trauma response. What kind of father would I be if I ignored that? What kind of father would I be if I put my own pride and my wife's comfort above my daughter's survival? He turned to Jennifer. Emma should live with you. Primary custody, full decision-making authority for her medical care, whatever you need. I want visitation. I want to be part of her life. But I understand now that I have a lot to learn about how to support her. I'll do the therapy, the training, whatever doctor or Emma's regular therapist recommends. I'll do the work. Then he turned to Karen, and his voice was cold. And you won't be part of Emma's life until you can prove that you understand the seriousness of her condition and that you respect her need for Max. I'm not asking. I'm telling you. The transformation in the courtroom was palpable. What had been a bitter, adversarial battle had shifted into something else entirely, a moment of painful but necessary truth. Judge sat back in her chair, removing her reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. In 23 years on the bench, she had never witnessed a custody case quite like this, one that had transformed from a bitter parental battle into a profound lesson about trauma, truth, and the lengths to which a child's body would go to protect itself. She looked out at the courtroom, Michael devastated and humbled, Karen pale and exposed, Jennifer exhausted but relieved, and the attorneys both clearly struggling to adjust to the sudden shift in dynamics. Mr. Judge began, her voice measured and thoughtful, I appreciate your willingness to withdraw your petition for primary custody. However, I want to be clear that this court's decision would have been the same regardless of your withdrawal. Based on the evidence presented, the expert testimony, and what I personally witnessed today, I would not have granted you primary custody under any circumstances, not because you're a bad father, but because the arrangement you proposed would have placed Emma in immediate danger. Michael nodded, unable to speak, tears still streaming down his face. That said, the judge continued, I don't believe that severing your relationship with Emma is in her best interest either. Children need their fathers, even imperfect ones who are willing to learn and grow. What Emma needs is a father who understands her disability, respects her medical needs, and supports the interventions that keep her safe. Judge turned her attention to the full courtroom. I'm going to issue a ruling today that will set a precedent for this court and hopefully for family courts across Texas. This ruling will address not just this family's immediate needs, but the broader question of how we handle service animals in custody disputes. She put her glasses back on and pulled her notes in front of her. First, the custody arrangement. Jennifer is hereby granted primary physical custody of Emma. Mrs. will have sole decision-making authority regarding Emma's medical care, mental health treatment, education, and therapeutic interventions. This is non-negotiable and will remain in effect until Emma reaches age 18, or until her treating psychiatrist determines that her PTSD has been resolved to the point where shared decision-making would be appropriate. Jennifer's shoulders sagged with relief, and she pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Second, regarding Max. This court officially recognizes Max as a certified psychiatric service dog and essential medical equipment under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Max is not a pet. Max is not subject to typical custody arrangements regarding family pets. Max is Emma's medical device, and he will remain with Emma at all times in all locations, without exception. Judge's voice grew firmer, more authoritative. Any attempt to separate Emma from Max, to restrict his access to Emma, or to interfere with his ability to perform his service functions will be considered a violation of federal disability law and a violation of this court order. This applies to both parents, to schools, to extended family members, and to any other individuals involved in Emma's care. She turned to Michael directly. Mister, you will have visitation rights with Emma, but those visits must accommodate Max's presence. You will not ask Emma to visit without Max. You will not suggest that Max stay elsewhere during visits. You will not allow anyone in your household, she glanced meaningfully at Karen, to make Emma feel unwelcome or uncomfortable about having Max with her. Is that absolutely clear? Yes, Your Honor, Michael said hoarsely, crystal clear. Furthermore, before you resume regular visitation with Emma, you will be required to complete a minimum of 40 hours of education on childhood PTSD, trauma-informed parenting, and service dog protocols. You will also attend at least 6 joint family therapy sessions with Emma and Mrs., facilitated by Dr. or another qualified trauma therapist. Only after Emma's therapist certifies that you understand her needs and that Emma feels safe with you will overnight visits be permitted. Michael nodded vigorously. I'll do whatever it takes, Your Honor, whatever Emma needs. I'm going to hold you to that, mister, because if I hear that you've backslid into dismissing Emma's needs, minimizing her disability, or pressuring her to be normal, I will not hesitate to restrict your access further. Do you understand? I understand. Judge then turned her attention to Karen, and her expression hardened considerably. Mrs. Karen, you have admitted in open court to providing false information that was used as the basis for legal arguments affecting a child's welfare. While I'm not going to pursue perjury charges at this time, I am going to make this perfectly clear. You will have no contact with Emma until you have completed, at minimum, the same 40 hours of PTSD education that I'm requiring of Mr., plus an additional 20 hours of education specifically focused on service animals and disability rights. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but her attorney placed a restraining hand on her arm and shook her head sharply. Additionally, the judge continued, you will submit a written apology to this court and to Emma, acknowledging that you lied about your allergies and explaining what you've learned about why service animals are essential for children with disabilities. This apology will be reviewed by Emma's therapist, and only if she determines that it demonstrates genuine understanding and remorse will you be permitted to have supervised contact with Emma. And let me be very clear, Emma is under no obligation to forgive you or to have a relationship with you, ever. That will be entirely her choice. The courtroom was silent, except for the soft sound of the court reporter's fingers on her machine. Judge's expression softened slightly as she addressed the broader implications of the case. I want to take a moment to talk about what happened here today, because I believe it has significance beyond this one family. We witnessed a child experience a medical crisis that was resolved by her service dog using specialized training. We heard expert testimony about the life-saving nature of that intervention. And we saw firsthand how prejudice, misunderstanding, and dishonesty about service animals can put a disabled child's life at risk. She looked around the courtroom, making eye contact with each attorney, each party, even the bailiff and court reporter. Service dogs are not pets. They are not accessories. They are not negotiable. When a child has a certified service dog for a documented disability, that animal is as essential to them as any medication, any medical device, any therapeutic intervention. Family courts must recognize this reality and protect these children's rights accordingly. Judge pulled out a formal document and began to sign it. I am therefore ordering that this case be published as precedent for Dallas County Family Court. Furthermore, I am recommending to the Texas Family Court Judges Association that statewide guidelines be developed for handling service animals in custody disputes. No child should have to suffer what Emma suffered today, having her medical needs questioned, her disability minimized, and her survival tools threatened, simply because her parents are divorcing. She signed the final page with a flourish and looked up. This court's order is effective immediately. Mrs., you and Emma may go home with Max today and every day hereafter. Mr., you will receive a detailed written order outlining the requirements for your visitation resumption. I expect compliance within 90 days. Ms. Mercer, Mr. Santos, you'll receive copies of all documentation for your files. Judge paused, her expression thoughtful. Before I adjourn, I'd like to say one more thing. Emma, if you're still in the building, I want you to know something. She spoke as though the little girl were in the room, her voice gentle but firm. "What you did today took tremendous courage. When you couldn't use your words, you found another way to ask for help. That's not weakness, that's intelligence. That's strength. You have a disability, yes, but you also have a remarkable ability to advocate for yourself. And you have a service dog who proves every day that accommodation isn't about making you less capable. It's about giving you the tools to be fully yourself." The judge's voice grew stronger. "Never let anyone make you feel ashamed for needing Max. Never let anyone tell you that you're broken or damaged or too dependent. You survived something terrible and you're learning to live with the scars it left behind. That makes you brave, not weak. And Max is your partner in that bravery. He's proof that asking for help is smart, that accepting support is courageous, and that love, whether from a parent or a dog, can be a force." Judge stood and everyone in the courtroom rose with her. "This court is adjourned." The gavel came down with a final, decisive crack. 6 months later, Emma sat on a blanket in her backyard. Max sprawled beside her in the warm afternoon sun. She was drawing in her sketchbook, a picture of a girl and a golden dog standing on top of a mountain, looking out at a bright horizon. The nightmares were less frequent now. The panic attacks still happened, but they were manageable, and Max was always there. Her mother called from the back porch, "Emma, your dad's here." Emma looked up to see Michael walking through the gate, carrying a gift bag. He'd completed his training months ago, along with the therapy sessions. He'd learned about PTSD, about triggers, about how trauma lives in the body. He'd learned to recognize the signs of Emma's distress, to respect Max's work, to be patient with her fears. "Hey, kiddo," Michael said, sitting down on the blanket carefully, making sure not to startle her. "I brought you something." Emma peered into the bag and pulled out a book, Service Dogs, Heroes in Fur. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I thought we could read it together," Michael said, "if you want, and maybe Max wants to hear it too." Max's tail thumped against the grass and Emma nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." As Michael opened the book and began to read, Emma leaned against Max's warm side and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time: safe. Not because the danger was gone. The memories would always be there, lurking in closets and shadows. But because she had tools now, support now, people who understood that her brain worked differently, and that was okay. She had her mother who had fought for her when fighting was hard. She had her father who had learned to see her instead of just looking at her. She had Doctor who helped her make sense of the scary things inside her head. And she had Max who had saved her life more times than she could count, simply by being exactly what he was trained to be: present, vigilant, and utterly devoted. In Dallas County Family Court, Judge's ruling had indeed become precedent. 7 more cases involving service animals and custody disputes had been successfully resolved using the framework she'd established. The Texas Family Court Judges Association had adopted her recommended guidelines. And Emma's story, though her name was changed for privacy, had been shared in legal journals and training seminars across the country. One little girl's secret signal had become a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that don't use words at all. And in a quiet backyard in Texas, a child and her dog sat in the sunshine, surrounded by people who had learned to love her not despite her scars, but including them, because those scars were part of her story, and her story was still being written, one safe day at a time.